Hi guys, welcome to the video. This is Cathal here. Now I'd like to deconstruct feminism for you today. Now this is not my normal area of expertise. I don't have an active interest in this field. But a few people have asked me to make some additional videos, so I will do my best today. I won't be too detailed. I'll paint with quite a broad brush, and I won't try to be exacting. Okay. Now, usually I write about system level issues concerning our financial systems. Now, as a system level intellectual, things at the system level are quite simple, actually. Okay, it's not that complicated. So for me to deconstruct feminism at the system level, I just have to answer some very simple questions for you. Primarily the question, what is feminism? For me to deconstruct feminism, I would have to answer that question with clarity, okay? So you would understand what feminism is. If I go out on the street, out there, and I talk to feminists, and some feminists are men, some feminists are women, if I were to ask them the question, what is feminism? I will not hear a uniform response or reply. They will use similar sounding words, but their answers will be different. And that's quite interesting, because you'd think that an ideology that's been around for 100 years would have a coherent ideology and message. You'll note that feminism often changes its message. It's morphing with time. So when you ask people what is feminism, you often get different answers. And that's quite curious, and I'll explain why that is at the end of the video. Okay? Now, for me to begin to deconstruct feminism, unfortunately I need to bring you back in time into the history. And this will be, the first part of this video will be a little bit of a history lesson. I'll try my best, okay? And I'll try to keep it as short as possible, okay? So for me to deconstruct feminism, I have to bring you back to the 1400s, to the island of Britain. In the 1400s, Britain was a deeply divided nation. The island was very violent. There had been civil warfare and wars of succession. There was the War of the Roses, which was extremely violent. Okay? There was many battles. Okay? So this was an embittered island. Okay? It was an unhappy place. The power structure on the island was feudal. There was a king. There were feudal lords that had a lot of land. There was the clergy, mostly monks, and they lived in monasteries. They were the intellectual elite of their time. And the top monks, the most intellectually gifted monks, would perform as counselors for the king and the noble lords and the heads of the noble families. And beneath that, then, were like the laity and the peasants, okay? And there were many of them. Now, this was a deeply unequal society, and it was impoverished. They were poor people. Incredibly poor. I think people today don't realize how poor humans were back then. I'm uncertain that they would even wear shoes. Most people would not have had shoes, perhaps, okay? So poverty was a significant issue and deeply ingrained in society. Okay. Now, the monastic elite near the end of the 1400s, they were the intellectual elite, the system level intellectuals. They were looking at a society that I believe was slipping into a deep regional reset. I think that's what they were looking at. The society was embittered and divided by warfare. And they had other problems in society, deep-seated problems that they became aware of. They found that there was a problem in society, an unhappy one. They found that top men in the society had a tendency to die of illness before their time. And they looked into this issue, and they studied this issue, and they discovered that the top men would tend to die after they got married, and they'd die of illness before their time. And when they made some inquiries and looked closely into this, they determined that the wives of the top men were murdering them, were assassinating them with poison. Okay? Now this was a really serious problem. And when the monks realized what was going on, obviously they were counselors to the noble families, so then the other noble families found out. And as a result, there was a huge increase in the rate of incest. Top men became scared of marrying women who were not their blood relation. And so they turned to incest. They would marry their first cousin, second cousin, even half-sister. You know, because they were afraid of women who were not blood relations. Okay? And so they turned to incest. Okay, this became a problem at the system level because if you practice incest, the children, the offspring, may have mental illness. They might not be top performers in the society. Okay? So the top intellectuals, the monks, had significant problems. They had an embittered society via warfare. They had a situation where top men were being murdered by their wives, because in the 1400s, if the wife murdered the husband, and you know there was no forensic evidence back then, there was no way to know definitively, so it'd be difficult to convict her for murder. The wife would inherit the land and the wealth and the money for herself and her family. Okay, that's what was going on. And then, you know, the noble lords started marrying, interbreeding. And this was obviously a big issue because this was banned by the church. The church knew that this resulted in low quality offspring. Okay? Now, near the end of the 1400s, the monastic elite, so the intellectual elite at the time, counseled the king to change the inheritance laws. They wanted to change things up. They got the king to change the inheritance laws so that only one man, the closest male relative, would inherit everything. Titles, land, and money. Get everything. Just one man. The nearest, closest male relative got everything. I believe this piece of legislative change that was established by around the year 1500 was the most important intellectual change in Western history. It dramatically improved everything for Britain. Instantly, after the law things were different then. So when you changed the law back then, the king wasn't that strong. Okay, the society was rudimentary. It took time for legal changes to become established. Okay? Like today, if we change the law today, the laws change tomorrow, you know. But back then, the king wasn't that powerful. The monks weren't that powerful either. So it took time to establish legal changes. But we know the change was in place by around 1500. And instantly, the deaths, you know, of married men, top men, you know, the way they would die suddenly, unexpectedly from poisoning and stuff, that stopped. There was no more of that. The life expectancy of top men increased after they got married. It was a good thing to get married then. You actually lived a longer life. And that was because the wife of the top man would have a strong incentive to keep him alive. If a top lady, if her husband died, she lost her status in the society. It decreased dramatically. She lost her title. She would be put into a granny flat to retire, and her first son, or if there were no sons, the husband's brother, oldest brother, would become the head of the family and inherit the money and the estate. Okay, so there was a strong incentive on the part of married ladies to take care of their husband, and they were called kept men. They were well kept. They minded them very carefully after this legislative change. They made sure that they had overcoats, they were well dressed, they had boots, they wouldn't go outside in the poor weather, they wouldn't engage in any dangerous activities, okay? They weren't allowed to drink heavily either, okay? Anything that could endanger the husband after that point was you're not allowed to do it. So they were called kept men. They were minded by their wives. And this was a very happy change for the society. Now, because there had been a big build-up of mistrust between the sexes, it took longer to stamp out the incest at the top of the society. But they were able to stamp it out eventually. But it took time because there was so much mistrust built up because of the murders. Okay? But the monks were able to stamp that out with time. It wasn't immediate. The third goal that the monks had was to force the second sons, fourth sons, third sons, and the daughters of the top men to be active in the civilization. Since they got no inheritance, the second sons and fourth sons and the fifth sons and the daughters, they were forced to work to produce their own goods and services. Those second sons became merchants, bankers, admirals, generals. They joined the Foreign Office, they built out the government, and they also built Great Britain, the huge world-spanning empire. It was amazing. And the daughters of the top families, they became famous artists, writers, some extraordinarily talented, and they became very famous in their own right. And also, since they got no inheritance, the daughters of the top men, they had to marry. It was a strong incentive for them to marry, because if a woman's given a large inheritance, there's a chance she won't marry. She'll just buy a cottage and have a servant take care of her. Okay? So this was extraordinary improvement in the society. It went from a divided island, Britain, to a world-spanning empire called Great Britain, almost immediately. Okay, so those monks were probably the most important intellectuals in history. They were the most influential. They were geniuses, okay? I believe in the late 1400s, they were looking at a situation where the island was slipping into a reset, and they saved Britain from that fate, and they produced an amazing empire and civilization. Okay, so that's the background history. That's the real history. It's not known by many, but it is known by some. Okay? Now, if you go on the Google and you do a search for the history of feminism, you'll see that they say the feminist historians will say that the precursor to feminism began in the 1850s. And it was these old women, they were ladies from the uber elite of the society. And they were very bitter. They were writing letters and essays, and they were very bitter and angry about the fact that they didn't get to inherit their deceased husband's estate and money. They were unhappy. And in the society, they were completely ignored by everybody. All right? Now, the feminist historians will be painting a picture like these old women were oppressed. There was some sort of patriarchy that was oppressing old women. It was deliberately sexist and unequal, and that's the reason why the legislation was that way, the inheritance laws. But that's not true at all. The reason why the old ladies from the top families didn't inherit everything was because they used to murder their husbands. That's the truth. That's the truth that not many people want to talk about, but it is true. Okay? So, that's the beginning of the feminist history, and it begins pretty much with a lie. Okay? So the question for me that I have to answer today is, what is feminism? If it's not coming from that, what is it? Okay, I have to answer that question. Well, if you're looking at a society like Great Britain, it was a world-spanning empire in the late 1800s. It was a fantastic society. So why did they change the legislation? Why did they allow women to vote and give them inheritance? Women could inherit the properties of their husbands in the 1920s. Why did they change the legislation? What happened between the late 1800s and the beginning and the 1920s that this changed? Why would they change the legislation when everything was working perfectly for everybody in the society? The society was working perfectly well. Why change anything? Well, the answer begins in the year 1900. There was an Austrian physician. His name is Karl. He was a genius, and he discovered blood types. Okay? And he was given the Nobel Prize for that discovery. They discovered that blood types were inherited. Hirschfeld discovered that in 1910, that blood types were inherited by mother and father. After 1910, you could use blood types to exclude a man as a father of a given child in 30 to 40% of paternity cases. So if there's a child over there, I can be excluded as the father in 30 to 40% of the cases, just using blood type analysis. If you get any given child, just random. Okay? We can use a blood test on him and me, and I can know definitively in 30% of the cases that I'm not the dad. Okay? So there was, for the first time in human history, the possibility of paternity exclusion. Okay? It wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking. How important in the olden times and today, how important was promiscuity in the late 1800s in the elite society? How common was it? What was going on there? What were they up to? We don't live back then, so what were they up to? Well, we do know how important was promiscuity to these guys. Well, I think it was very important. To humans, I think it's very important. If we look at the example of King Charles II, he may have had up to 21 illegitimate children. Perhaps only 13, but he had a lot. King Charles II was a very generous man and kindly. He was a good king. In his life, many women came up to him and said, hey, this child, it's yours. You're the dad. And he was honorable enough and generous enough to give those children noble titles, land, estates. He accepted them as his child and made sure that they were perfectly good and gave them noble titles. They became nobles. And the mothers of those children were kept women. They were well-minded. Okay, so their life, their destiny was transformed by having promiscuous sex with the king. Okay. Now after 1910, King Charles II could use a blood type test, if he was around that time, to discover whether the children were actually his or not in 30 to 40% of the cases. Okay? This was a huge change. It was interrupting the survival and procreation strategies of numerous women in the society. How important is promiscuity? It's very important. One of the illegitimate children that King Charles II had, the descendant of which was Princess Diana. And her son, Prince William, will be the King of Britain one day. Okay, so you can go from being a normal peasant woman, having a promiscuous relationship with the king, and as a result, your son or descendant can become the king himself. And we're going to have that example in Britain soon. Okay? One day. Hopefully not too soon, but it's going to happen. I think Prince William will be a good king. Okay? That's how important promiscuity is to humans. For both top males and for females in this society, especially females from the lower classes. Their destiny and their survival chances can be radically improved via promiscuity. All right? There's nothing wrong with this. This is just natural. Okay? Survival back then was difficult. People had very poor clothing. Indoor heating didn't exist. Shoes were a luxury. Okay? These were difficult times to survive. You had to take your chance. If an opportunity presented itself, you took it. You know, if you were brave, if you had courage. All right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so the result of the paternity testing technology after 1910. Now, it was only immediately available to the elite men, the intellectual elite and the power elite, the top of the society. The immediate reaction was first wave feminism, which began around 1912, 1914. We know by 1920s the legislation had changed. Women started agitating after 1910. Elite women only, by the way. Started agitating for changes to the inheritance legislation. And they were given the vote, and they were able to inherit property in the 1920s. Okay? Next phase begins in 1958 with the discovery of HLA antigens. Okay? The HLA antigen allowed for an improvement in paternity testing technology. Now, in 80% of the paternity cases, a man could be excluded as the father of a given child. So it went from 30 to 40% up to 80% exclusion rate in 1958. We do know that by the early 1960s, perhaps 1961 to 1960, it was commercially available in the United States of America. The instant reaction by the unconscious mind was second wave feminism. It began in the mid-60s. At this point, feminists, both male and female, the women needed to be able to divorce their husband and have abortions. Also, since a man could exclude himself as the father of a given child, the desirability of marriage decreased for a lot of low-class women, low-grade women in the society. Because a common reproductive strategy for women of the lower classes is to marry someone in an equal class and just have promiscuous sex with top-grade men and have their children. Okay? That was a common reproductive strategy, I believe, in the 1900s, and it got impaired badly by the improved paternity testing technology that came online after 1958. Okay? So there was a reaction in the unconscious mind to this technology. Third phase was in 1988, and that was with DNA testing. That was extraordinarily, because at that point in 1988, men couldn't just be excluded as the father. You could actually know, a man could know if he was the father of a given child. With 99.99% probability, you could know if you were the father of a biological child. You're the biological father. Okay? With that degree of certainty. This was extraordinary. Once again, the desirability of marriage decreased. The risk of promiscuity increased dramatically. If a married woman had sex with some strange guy, like top man that she met at work or something like that, if the husband found out, there was going to be serious problems, right? Right? There was going to be significant issues there. Yeah, there was a threat. Could be fighting. People would be very angry with that. So there was changes then to the legislation. After 1988, we had third wave feminism in the 1990s. At this point, they needed the dilute model of policing. Women needed to be able to kick the man out of the house with, say, false accusations of domestic violence, what have you. They needed increasing amounts of alimony. If a husband wasn't the biological father of a child, he could be kicked out of the house and still forced to pay child support for the child that isn't even his. And that's the legislation, that's the law. Okay. Who's writing the laws? Well, it's the top man in the society. Well, they're not really the top, but they're pretty high-grade humans. They're high-status males. And they're writing the legislation because they want to engage in promiscuity with lower-class women, other guys' girlfriends, and they don't want to pay the child support. Many of these legislators and judges, they're married. And with the DNA technology, they could be identified with 100% 99% probability that he's the dad, so he'd have to pay child support. Can you imagine being a judge or a legislator, and some woman says, "You're the father of my child. You got to pay me child support," and that man's married. So after the 1990s, the reaction by the unconscious mind was third wave feminism. You saw a huge increase in the social welfare state. The government, the top men, they passed legislation that allowed for an extraordinary increase in the welfare state. Unmarried women were given money. So working class men and women were taxed at a very increasingly high rate, so it's called income tax. Increasingly high rates of income tax. They were just being taken from them. Their wealth was being taken from them by the top males who were passing the laws and giving it to unmarried women and children of unmarried women. So they were called single moms, I believe, okay? Or single parent households. And you saw a huge increase in that. So the question I have to answer is, what is feminism? Feminism is a reaction by the unconscious mind to paternity testing technology. The more advanced the technology became, the stronger the reactions became. Okay? There was 3 waves of feminism. Each wave was preceded by an advance in paternity testing technology. Okay? Now, there was also recently some sort of 4th wave. I believe it had something like, believe all women, and these other slogans, I'm not sure, Me Too, and things like that. And I believe that, as a result of the collapse in the marriage rate and the increase in poverty, I think there's an increasing amount of childless women. I believe there's a lot of anger, and anxiety and depression, and a lot of women, and perhaps even with top men in the society. So there's been a significant increase in anxiety in the general population. They're anxious and they're worried. I have a lot of sympathy for these people. I'm a system level intellectual, don't like to do any judgment. Do have a lot of sympathy for these people. The situation is that humans have evolved to be this way. Hypergamy, promiscuity, at the system level, I don't really see it as negative. It's just neutral. It helps to improve the species over time. So I don't really mind it. Personally, I'm not upset or angry or unmotivated by it. It's just normal, it's natural. But at the top of the society, the intellectual elites, over the last 100 years have produced technology that have disrupted and undermined the survival and reproductive strategies of a lot of people, men and women. And that may not be entirely fair, okay? The elite humans are doing this, enforcing change. They were hoping, I believe, to create the technology that would demand moral behavior by the humans, by the lower grade humans. I believe that's what their hope was, that by introducing paternity testing technology, it would demand moral behavior from the humans, the less gifted humans, okay? Unfortunately, I think that has happened to a degree. I think a lot of people are okay with being honest. They have moral sexual behaviors. They're committed to one another, they have family, and I can only sympathize with these people because they're just doing their best. But with people who had evolved a strong sense of promiscuity, that they were hoping to use promiscuity as part of their reproductive and survival strategy, they've become increasingly unhappy, depressed, and anxious. And I do have a lot of sympathy for that. So unfortunately we have slipped into the reset that the monks were hoping to avoid in the 1400s. Those monks, using their intellectual genius, were able to ensure Britain didn't slip into a reset. But we have slipped into a system-level reset now as a result of these policies that have been implemented over the last 100 years. The governments are mostly bankrupt. They're bankrupted by the welfare state. Fertility and marriage rates have collapsed. Where are the reactions, from the unconscious mind? Where are they strongest? Well, I would say they're strongest in the United Kingdom and the United States of America. They're strongest where the technology was first rolled out. In France, they banned paternity testing technology. Ireland, it's limited, like a husband can't paternity test his own child, only the mother can. So they're trying to mollify the unconscious mind of France by banning the technology. It's not necessarily a bad idea. So I don't have any moral judgment concerning this issue. I just have sympathy for the humans because it's difficult to survive in this world. It's not easy. Men and women, it ain't easy. So you have to take your chances if they are presented to you. Now, the only moral argument or judgment I could make will be perhaps in certain, where the reaction is strongest. So this reaction is now global. Feminism is spread wherever the technology is. It's now Russia, China, Thailand. It's everywhere. I've lived in 52 countries. I can tell you it's spreading everywhere. Wherever the technology is, the ideology called feminism has spread to. It's a reaction by the unconscious mind. Where is it strongest? It's strongest in the UK and US, where the technology was first rolled out. Gender relations in those countries are quite bad. I would say terrible at this point. Really bad. In the UK, I just give you an example. So my sister lives in London. She's from the upper classes. She lives a very good life, and she lives in a very wealthy neighborhood. So her neighbor is an IT consultant and expert. He's a man, married with 2 kids, young kids. He goes to the public swimming pool with his kids, just him and the kids, right? He washes his daughter's hair in the swimming pool, the open showers, right? Next week, a child protection service officer knocked on his door and said someone reported him for misconduct because he washed his daughter's hair at the swimming pool. Someone made that report against him. He had a nervous breakdown. And then went on welfare. He went on disability. And then he just collects disability checks. I believe because he paid so many taxes in his life, he just went on disability. He said, now I'm disabled. And he collects this disability check from the government. So he's on the welfare. He's on the dole. And now, the social welfare officer comes to the house, and actually instead of like being concerned about his behavior at the swimming pool, she's trying to get him to work again. But he won't. He said, I'm disabled now. This is where we're at. That's just terrible outcome. Almost comical. Clown world. It's quite bad in the UK. And because of the internet, these stories spread. Like I can make this video now, tens of thousands of men can watch it, and they'll know. And then they'll be careful. In the United States, the only moral judgment I'd make would be concerning, obviously, it's immoral to kick a man out of his house, to restrict access to offspring. It's kind of immoral to do that. But the most immoral action would be probably, as far as I can see, some women in the society in the United States, they were engaging in behaviors, very poor behaviors, so as to get the husband to commit suicide. So some women turn to like public adultery, belittling their husband in public, saying really poor things about the man, shaming him in public, so as to get the man to commit suicide. So the risks that the top men in the 1400s in Britain were exposed to, the risk of assassination via poisoning, the upper middle class and the middle class men in the United States were being exposed to after second wave feminism. Some wives wanted their husbands dead so they could get everything. They couldn't use poison because there's autopsy technology. So they turned to really unpleasant and evil behaviors to get the husband to commit suicide. And that is wrong. That's morally wrong behavior. You shouldn't do that. But aside from these extreme cases, I do have a lot of sympathy for the general population. I hope I've answered your question today. I've kept it as broad as possible. I didn't want to be too detailed, but I've done my best. I hope you have an enjoyable day, and I will see you next time. Okay, bye.